Hello folks, so I want to make a short video discussing spear versus sword. So the first thing to say is that common perception is that the sword is a better weapon than a spear. Well, obviously everything depends on context, and if you're fighting in a small space then a dagger is probably a best weapon. So everything has its place and everything has its purpose, but the important thing to say at the beginning is that a sword in most periods of history and in most situations is a secondary weapon. Okay, it might even be a tertiary weapon in fact, but it's not usually a primary weapon. There have of course been exceptions to this. You could argue that at certain periods Roman legionaries had the gladius as their primary weapon. You could say that certain types of light cavalry in Napoleonic Wars, for example, had a sabre as their primary weapon, and so on. But generally speaking, throughout history, people who carried swords had as their first weapon either a pole weapon, a spear or a halberd or a poleaxe or something like that, or they had a missile weapon of some sort, i.e. a musket or a rifle or a pistol or a longbow or a crossbow, and so on. So the sword that's why it's called a sidearm, because you can wear it conveniently. It's also the popular weapon of civilians and travellers, because you can go about your daily business wearing a sword. You can't go about your daily business carrying a spear very easily, or walking around with a loaded crossbow. First of all, in most periods of history, having a spear or a halberd in your hand, or having a loaded gun or a loaded crossbow was not necessarily socially or even legally acceptable. But a sword is a much more convenient object, and you walk around with it. So going back to the question of sword versus spear, well, in a straight up fight, one-on-one, in an open space, in a field or in a large hall, generally speaking, the spear has the advantage. And most of you who've done any sparring of spear or naginata or yari or any long pole weapon versus sword, and any kind of sword, will know that the polearm, generally speaking, has the advantage. If you look at kenjutsu videos, then you will see that they actually practice, they have quite a lot of techniques of naginata and yari against sword. And a lot of the techniques that you practice in Japanese swordsmanship, or indeed in European swordsmanship, are learning ways that you can counter and attack the guy with the long weapon with the shorter weapon. But that's not to say that they are equal. It's simply so that you can learn how you might be able to deal with the person who has the longer or superior weapon. So, in short, why is the spear or polearm superior to the sword? Well, the most obvious reason is reach. Okay, you can very easily reach very, very far, very, very quickly with a pole weapon. Okay, you can cover a huge amount of distance with an attack and stab someone or hit someone very, very quickly who's a long way away, far further than you'd be able to hit them with a sword. So distance is the obvious advantage. The next one is where you can attack with a spear. So for example, I can go from high to low with a very small movement of my hands, because it's a great big long lever. So a small movement at the back end means a big movement at the front end. Whereas with a sword, I have to move my arm a lot further and wider to hit different targets. A spear or a polearm can hit different targets much more easily and rapidly from one place to another. And the third important reason why a polearm is advantageous over a sword is leverage. Your hands are further apart and the weapon itself is generally heavier. Unless we're talking about big two-handed swords, but let's leave them to another video. So your hands are further apart and the object is a bit heavier. So even if the person with the sword binds against your weapon, you can often push their weapon aside or push it out of the way in order to get your point into them or edge into them, because you have superior push and leverage. For that reason and others, the person with the sword is mostly thinking about trying to cross the pole weapon or grab the pole weapon and come in close as quickly as possible to try and shorten the range and fight at the distance where their sword can come into its own, and hopefully your pole weapon will be at a disadvantage. The only thing that I would mention in regard to that is something that people often forget, is just because my reach is a maximum of, say, 5 or 6 feet from my body with the pole weapon, I can very, very quickly retract the pole weapon to fight at sword distance as well. So even if a sword person crosses my weapon and charges in, unless they've grabbed my weapon, I can retract it and attack them again and keep them at distance. So pole weapons are incredibly formidable. The last thing I would say on the side of the sword is that something which gets overlooked a lot by people who do sparring is that with sharp weapons things often work a little bit differently. And if I just put the sword down for a second, if we're dealing with either one-handed swords, so we've got a broad cutting sword at the top here, and a pointier, a quicker sword, so this is a sort of 14th, 15th century type, this one at the top is more of a sort of 11th or 12th century type. Whether we're dealing with one-handed swords or if we're dealing with long swords, they all have quite good cutting capacity. And something that you can't simulate in sparring is that when you hit a spear, whether it's attacking you or whether you're attacking them, it has a wooden shaft. And you often do damage to a wooden shaft when you hit it with a sharp blade. Now, many pole weapons had long iron or steel langets, they're called, which are sort of bars or strips that run down the side that protect the wood of the shaft. Now, in experimentation with test cutting, we found that a spear-sized ash shaft, so essentially a spear shaft which we used, we found that with 3 good angled chops of a sword, you were often able to break the spear shaft. Usually what you'd find is the first blow would take a scoop out if you hit it at an angle rather than directly straight into the wood. The second one would take another scoop or possibly start to split the shaft, and the third hit would often snap what was remaining of the shaft. So this is something you can't simulate in sparring. So whilst in sparring the pole weapon always or generally has the advantage for the person using it compared to the swordsman, in real fight where you're dealing with a sharp sword that does damage to the pole weapon, it maybe comes back a little bit more in the direction of the swordsperson. I still think that the pole arm has the advantage, but maybe the advantage isn't as big as it appears in sparring. Thank you.